Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Maayan Shvo, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto. And I'd like to talk to you today about our work on the role of theory of mind and explanation, done in collaboration with Toryn, Klassen, and Sheila, McIlraith. Second, yeah. Okay, so to ground us, theory of mind is commonly defined as the ability to attribute mental states such as beliefs, goals, desires to oneself and to others. And let's start with a simple example from our paper that will accompany us throughout the talk and which illustrates the use of theory of mind and explanation. So in this example, we have three roommates, Mary, Bob, and Tom. You can see them here. The important thing to know about this text is from the paper, but the important thing to know about their current situation is that it rained last night. There's a hole in the roof, if you can see it here, and the floor is therefore sadly wet somewhere in their apartment. Now, Bob here, he sleeps in a windowless room, right? And so is not aware of the rain. He never hears it or sees it when it rains overnight. He is, however, aware of the hole in the roof since he and Mary discovered it a few days ago. And both Bob and Tom are, of course, not aware of the wet floor. So in the morning, before Bob and Tom go and slip on the wet floor, Mary rushes to explain the situation to both of them. Her explanation to Bob is that it had rained last night because she knows that he is aware of the hole in the roof, right? Because they discovered it together. And that he's not aware of the fact that it had rained last night because of his windowless room situation. On the other hand, Tom is not aware of the hole in the roof since he was away on a business trip when it was discovered. He is, however, aware that it had rained last night. And so when Mary explains the wet floor to him, she mentions the hole in the roof rather than the rain as she did for Bob. So clearly we can see that Mary tailored her explanations to each of her housemates, believing the information she was providing to them was sufficient to explain the wet floor in their respective mental states, right, about which she has certain beliefs. And Mary's ability to do this stems from her theory of mind, her ability to attribute mental states, beliefs, for example, to herself and to others, in this case, her roommates. Now, and we'll see this example come back soon in the talk. So the use of theory of mind in explanation has been demonstrated empirically in humans by Slugoski et al., among others, with a set of experiments that show that, quite intuitively for us as beings who likely explain things to different people all the time, and it's been shown empirically with a set of experiments that show that human participants gave different explanations to different explainees, the recipients of explanations, based on their beliefs about the beliefs of the explainee. And there also exists a respectable body of work in AI that has highlighted, the importance of theory of mind and explanation, and some of those works are listed here. And in our work, we build and expand upon this body of work and posit that accounts of explanation that employ theory of mind must satisfy a number of important desiderata. And first, we say that such accounts of explanation must be set in a multi-agent setting, which facilitates explanation between arbitrarily many explainers and explainees. And we'll see an example for that in a second. And such accounts of explanation should also support a myriad of different agent types, whose beliefs may be internally represented very differently. For example, an explainee's beliefs may be stored in a human brain, while the explainer's beliefs may be stored in, let's say, the parameters of a neural network or formulae in a knowledge base. And it's important to accommodate all those different types of agents. And so importantly, we must enable an explainer to consider the beliefs of the explainee, which may not all correspond to some ground truth, but rather may be false or simply incomplete. And of course, the beliefs of the explainer themselves may be false. And we'll see an example for that as well in a second. And in addition, an explanation for the explainer, importantly, may not be an explanation for the explainee due to their differing beliefs. And the explainer must therefore be able to put itself in the shoes of the explainee to provide an appropriate explanation for them, as we've seen Mary do for each of her roommates. And finally, we must enable the explainer to consider how a potential explanation is assimilated by the explanee. That is, how the explanee revises their beliefs given the explanation, which may very well be inconsistent with their possibly false beliefs. And we'll see this illustrated in our example later on. And while previous work has addressed some of these desiderata, in our work, we propose a belief level account of explanation that satisfies all of these desiderata and does so by employing a number of crucial building blocks. So what are these building blocks? Let's go over them. First, we build on a body of work that defined explanation relative to the epistemic state of the explanee, where the epistemic state captures the explanee's beliefs without commitment to a specific representation of those beliefs. Rather, in order to capture the diversity of human and machine explainers and explanees, as we just argued is needed in a theory of mind account of explanation, explainers and explanees in our account are attributed mental state in the form of these general epistemic states. And so by defining explanations relative to the epistemic states of agents, we don't make in our work any assumptions about the particular syntactic form of the beliefs of the explainers and explanees, in contrast to some previous work in the field. Next, a very large body of work spanning many decades has studied how agents revise their beliefs in the presence of new, possibly inconsistent information, while maintaining consistency in their set of beliefs. And over the decades, a number of popular guiding principles have emerged for performing this belief revision. In explanation, it is often the case, as in our housemates example, that an explanation conflicts with the explanee's current beliefs. And so the explanee cannot just add the conflicting belief to its set of beliefs. In such cases, the explanee must revise its beliefs in order to both accept the explanation and maintain consistency of its set of beliefs. And by appealing to a general belief revision operator in our account of explanation, as we'll see in a second, we allow for explanations that are inconsistent with the explanee's beliefs and can capture the mechanism by which the explanee can revise her beliefs to incorporate the new information given to them. And it's important to note that the way in which the revision operator is realized may differ greatly between agents such as humans and artificial neural networks, which may have very different ways of revising their beliefs. And so in short, just to reiterate, by synthesizing ideas from these bodies of work, our account of explanation can satisfy the desiderata we mentioned previously, in which are listed here, and capture the many roles of theory of mind in explanation, and explanation more generally between a myriad of different agent types. Okay, good. So let's lay some formal groundwork to see how we define an explanation in our framework, and then we'll illustrate everything using our running example. In our account of explanation is set in a multi-agent setting where we can accommodate an arbitrary number of explainers and explanees. To this end, we define a collection of epistemic states, VEC-E here, where each EI captures the beliefs of agent I in our set of agents. And an epistemic state importantly captures what certain agents believe about other agents and about the world more generally. Specifically, we use the belief modality B to capture agent beliefs. And so BI phi here should be interpreted as agent I believes some phi to be true. And so now we're actually ready to define an explanation as we do in a framework. And we say that some alpha explains beta, the explanandum, the thing to be explained. It explains beta for agent I if revising by alpha makes agent I believe beta while still having consistent beliefs, where the box modality here at the beginning is defined in terms of the agent's belief revision operator that I mentioned is included in our framework. And we abbreviate this definition of explanation with the term EXPL here, which you'll see used throughout the talk. But remember that importantly, we want to talk about an explainer's theory of mind. And so we also define a so-called subjective explanation, where in this case, agent J believes that some alpha explains beta for some agent I. In other words, right, agent J believes that when agent I revises her beliefs by alpha, she will entail the explanandum beta, which is exactly the definition we were after. And as I keep mentioning, we'll see an example for this in a second. And we'll see that now, in fact. Let's go back to a roommate example. Let's formalize it a bit using the definitions we've just seen and use it to illustrate a number of elements of theory of mind reasoning that are nicely captured by our account of explanation. So again, we have Mary and Bob here as before. And in the morning, as mentioned, Mary rushes to explain to Bob why the floor is wet and also hopefully save him from from tripping on that wet floor. And now consider this using what we've seen formalized. Consider that Mary believes that Bob has a false belief that it hasn't rained last night, right? And this is because she knows that he lives in a windowless room and is never aware of the rain. So you can see that kind of visualized here above her head and in the formula below using the belief modality we've just seen. And this is why it's important to define an explanation as we have relative to a belief revision operator. Since simply adding the fact that it had rained last night to Bob's set of beliefs will leave him with an inconsistency, namely that it had both rained and not rained last night. And note that Mary also believes, that Bob believes, that there is a hole in the roof. You can see that here and here, since they found it together a couple of days ago. And so putting that together and using our definition of explanation, and given that Mary believes, that Bob believes, that rain and hole in roof entail wet floor, which is not mentioned here, the fact that it had rained last night, that Mary can be seen here articulating to Bob, will be a subjective explanation for the wet floor for Bob, from Mary's perspective. And again, see the formula here below, which should be interpreted as Mary believes that rain explains the wet floor for Bob. You see here, that's a subjective explanation formula. And similarly for Tom, who also requires an explanation of the wet floor. And as you'll recall, Tom was on a business trip. And so Mary believes that Tom is not aware of the hole in the roof that she had discovered with Bob while Tom was away. And you can see that visualized here above Mary and in the formula. And in this case, Mary, using her theory of mind, can tailor an explanation to Tom and tell him about the hole in the roof that she and Bob had found yesterday, which again is a subjective explanation from Mary's perspective for the wet floor, but for Tom this time. And of course, notice that it's different than the explanation she gave to Bob. And sometimes an explainer might wish to explain something to multiple explainees at the same time, perhaps to save some time or for other reasons. And in our example, imagine Mary wanting to explain the wet floor to both Bob and Tom at the same time. What you could do then is to say to both of them together that it had rained last night and that there is a hole in the roof. And again, our framework easily captures this since Mary can reason about the epistemic states of both Bob and Tom together. Good, so those were a few examples of the expressivity of our framework, and kind of so far we assume that there is an explicit thing to be explained. There was this explanandum beta, in this case it was the wet floor for Bob and Tom. But interestingly, the explainer, Mary of course in our case, may use her theory of mind to put herself in the shoes of one of her housemates and try to identify discrepancies between their respective beliefs and her own. And so a discrepancy in our example between, and there's a discrepancy in our example, as you can notice, between Mary's epistemic state and Bob's epistemic state, which is the fact that it had rained last night. So you can see that Mary believes that it rained last night. She also believes that Bob believes that it hadn't rained last night. And Mary can identify this as a discrepancy. And in the paper, we talk about discrepancy resolving explanations that can fix these discrepancies between the beliefs of the explainer and the explainee. For example, in this case, Mary telling Bob that it had rained last night resolves the discrepancy between the respective epistemic states. And notice, of course, that Bob is not even aware of this discrepancy because of his unique beliefs. And this is, of course, an important capability for AI systems, more generally, who should be able to anticipate and resolve discrepancies between them and other AI systems or humans without necessarily being prompted to do so, but rather, such systems could put themselves in the shoes of another agent to detect these discrepancies. For example, a planning agent who may have beliefs about the beliefs of some observing agent about their own planning model, right, could kind of realize that because of a discrepancy in their beliefs, they might not understand why the robot is planning in the way they are, and provide some explanation, kind of not prompted explicitly, but taking initiative and proactively supplying that explanation. Good. And so far, we also assume that Mary has a completely accurate picture of Tom and Bob's beliefs. And of course, this is often not the case. And agents often have an inaccurate, or at the very least, partial idea of what another agent's mind holds. And of course, an explainer's explanations to some explainee are only as good as the accuracy of the beliefs of the explainer about the beliefs of the explainee. And in the paper, we formalize the notion of adequacy. That is, how accurate should the explainer's beliefs be in order to robustly generate good explanations for some explainee. And let's illustrate what happens when an explainer, Mary in our case, holds inaccurate beliefs about the beliefs of her housemates. So imagine that Mary completely forgot for some reason that Bob had found the hole in the roof with her, and so falsely believes that Bob is not aware of the hole in the roof, as is visualized here, where Bob in fact is of course aware of the hole in the roof. So you can see Mary's beliefs here about Bob's beliefs, and you can see Bob's actual beliefs. So in this case, in order to explain the wet floor to Bob, Mary will tell him both that there is a hole in the roof and that it had rained last night. And while this example is extremely simple and is perhaps not too bad to get that extra piece of information, we can imagine how annoying it would be to consistently receive more information than we need to when someone explains something to us. And it could possibly even be overwhelming or detrimental if the amount of information given is large enough. Sometimes you just won't be able to make out the important information out of that bundle of information. And in fact, of course, there exists a very large body of work on explanation that has formalized notions of minimality and sufficiency of an explanation. And we mentioned some of these in the paper. So next, consider that for some reason, Mary falsely believes that Bob is aware that it had rained last night, but not aware of the hole in the roof. She has it completely in reverse for some reason. And in this case, Mary's explanation to Bob will be that there is a hole in the roof. And this unfortunately will fail to explain the fact that the floor is wet to Bob, because Mary failed to supply him with sufficient information, which in this case is the fact that it had rained last night. And we can see Bob's confusion here. Mary's explanation is simply not good enough because of her inaccurate beliefs about Bob's beliefs. In the paper, we discuss some methods by which to mitigate for the inadequacy of the explainer's beliefs, some of which have been proposed by previous work. For example, the explainer may generate conformant explanations that are applicable to a set of possible explainee models, which arise as the consequence of explainer uncertainty pertaining to the explannee's beliefs. So if Mary is unsure about Bob's beliefs, she could try to, hit a few different models, despite her uncertainty. And so that's one way to mitigate for that. And so finally, to conclude, we've talked here about our belief level account of explanation, which defines explanations relative to the epistemic states of explainers and explainees, and incorporates a belief revision operator to allow for explanations that are inconsistent with the explainee's beliefs. And importantly, we've talked about how our account of explanation satisfies important desiderata for theory of mind and explanation by building on rich bodies of previous work. And this is important because while previous work has addressed some of these desiderata, our work satisfies all of them. And our work also presents and discusses, two important notions that we've seen illustrated in the talk, namely the notion of explainer-explainee discrepancies that allow an explainer to anticipate when an explainee might require an explanation, rather than having, assuming some explicit prompt, some explicit explanandum to be explained. And also we've seen the notion of the adequacy of the explainer's beliefs about the beliefs of the explainee, which determines the quote unquote quality of its explanations. And there are, of course, many possible paths for future work, including the realization of our approach for different types of explainers and explainees. And we discuss a number of options for doing so in the paper. And with that, I'll actually conclude a bit ahead of time. Thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you.